Imagine a village in the heart of Britain, centuries ago. The fields are quiet. The workshops are still. The only sound is the wind rustling through the thatched roofs of silent cottages. But then another sound begins, the slow, rhythmic tolling of a church bell. It's a sound that doesn't celebrate a wedding or call the faithful to prayer. It's a sound that counts the dead, and it never seems to stop. This was the reality during the long plague years. Before science could explain the invisible enemy that traveled on the air and in the blood, people turned to a different kind of knowledge, a darker, older wisdom made of ritual, superstition, and fear. They sought to control the uncontrollable, to give a face to the formless terror that was emptying their world. They looked for signs in the sky, whispered charms against the night air, and appointed watchers to stand guard over the border between the living and the dead. These are the stories of those watchers and the strange rituals they performed in the shadow of the pestilence. These are the forgotten folk beliefs of Britain and Ireland during the Age of Plague. Welcome to the Candlelight Historian. Tonight, we draw back the veil on the eerie and shocking folklore of the plague years. The shadow of pestilence. From the first devastating wave of the Black Death in the 14th century, plague was not a single event, but a recurring nightmare. It returned to Britain again and again for over 300 years, with major outbreaks striking London in 1563, 1593, 1603, and 1625, before the final Great Plague of 1665. It was a constant, generational terror. The symptoms were the stuff of nightmares, a raging fever, compulsive vomiting, a swollen tongue, and the horrifying appearance of buboes, agonizingly painful swellings in the groin and armpits that turned the skin black in patches. In Wales, it was described as a tempest that began with innocent shivers becoming creeping chills before erupting into an ungodly heat. In 1665, the diarist Samuel Pepys wrote of the melancholy emptiness of London's streets, where one could hear nothing but everybody talking of this dead and that man sick. In an age of faith, such a catastrophe could only be interpreted in two ways, as the righteous wrath of God or the malevolent work of the devil. The official medical theory of the time wasn't far removed from the supernatural. Doctors spoke of a miasma, a foul, corrupted air that rose from corpses and putrescent matter carrying disease with it. This idea of an invisible airborne killer was ancient. Old English texts referred to it as an anphleoga, or solitary flyer. If death was an unseen presence in the very air one breathed, it was a short leap of the imagination to see it as a demon or an avenging spirit. This belief system was reinforced by the utter failure of the established authorities. As one medieval historian noted, doctors from every part of the world had no good remedy or effective cure. The Church simply stated that illness was a punishment for sin, and prescriptions became prayers. With no cure and little comfort from official sources, ordinary people turned to their own resources. They reached for a deep well of folk belief, a blend of Christian prayer and far older traditions. These weren't just quaint superstitions. They were a functional worldview, a set of tools for confronting a horror that defied all understanding. People didn't just die of plague. They were stalked by it. And to survive, they believed they had to watch for it, guard against it, and sometimes even bargain with it. Plague watchers and guardians. As the plague tightened its grip, society created new, grim professions. The most visible were the watchmen, tasked with enforcing the quarantine of infected houses. When a household was struck by plague, the authorities would lock the door from the outside, painting a red cross upon it with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." For 40 days, No one was allowed in or out. The watchman stood guard, a sentinel posted at the door of a tomb where the inhabitants were often left to die. This policy of shutting up houses was, for many, a death sentence, and the watchmen were seen as jailers. Daniel Defoe, in his famous Journal of the Plague Year, recounts desperate tales of families trying to escape their confinement. In one case, a family blew up their watchman with gunpowder, burning the poor fellow dreadfully, and scrambled out the windows while he cried for help. In another grim account, a watchman stood guard over a house from which he had heard crying. He stopped the dead cart several times, but the family inside had fallen silent. Eventually, a magistrate ordered the door broken down, only to find a single young woman, delirious but alive, amidst the bodies of her family. Even more feared were the searchers of the dead. This revolting job fell almost exclusively to poor, elderly women, often destitute widows who would otherwise be on parish support. Their official duty was to enter infected homes, inspect the bodies for the telltale signs, the buboes and sores, and report the cause of death to the parish clerk. These women were social outcasts, required to live apart from the community and to carry a white stick in public as a warning to others to keep their distance. Their position was a deeply compromised one. A family, terrified of being locked in, might bribe a searcher to report a different cause of death. The statistician John Graunt noted their incompetence, remarking that a cup of ale and a doubling of their fee was often enough for a searcher to change the cause of death to one more convenient for the household. Defoe agreed, noting with deep suspicion how the official plague numbers in some parishes were impossibly low, calling it all knavery and collusion. These women, illiterate, untrained, and taking on a job so dangerous that most died from the very diseases they diagnosed, held the fate of entire households in their hands. They were the first plague watchers, the official witnesses to the disease, and their presence was a sure sign that death was your new neighbor. Charms, omens, and ghosts. Long before the first watchman took his post, people watched the skies for signs of the coming doom. In England, the appearance of a comet or a blazing star was seen as a divine warning. Before the 1665 outbreak, Defoe wrote that Londoners were gripped by fear, staring at a comet whose dull, languid color and its motion very heavy, solemn and slow, was read as a portent of a slow but terrible judgment. Some even claimed to see apparitions in the clouds, a flaming sword, or an angel clothed in white. In Wales, the plague was not a distant warning from God, but a tangible monster. The 6th century pestilence known as Y Fad Phelan, or the Yellow Plague, was described as a hideous hag with yellow hair and teeth, or a column of cloud that stalked the land. It was said that the king, Maelgwn Gwynedd, saw the creature through the keyhole of a church door and died instantly. In Scotland and Ireland, death sent messengers. The Scottish Bean-Nighe, or washerwoman, was a fairy spirit seen at a stream, washing the bloody shrouds of those about to die. To see her was a death sentence. In Ireland, the wail of the banshee foretold a death in a family, her cry summoning the Quaist Bodar, a silent death coach driven by a headless horseman to collect the soul of the doomed. To protect themselves, people relied on charms. The most famous was abracadabra, written in a triangle on parchment and worn around the neck. Defoe saw Londoners wearing papers with sacred symbols, hoping to ward off what they believed was a kind of possession of an evil spirit. But when the charms failed, the dead did not always rest. The trauma of the plague years left its mark on the landscape in the form of ghost stories. In a narrow passage near Bishopsgate Churchyard in London, Defoe saw a man frantically pointing at a gravestone, swearing he could see a ghost making gestures that foretold the filling of the graveyard with bodies. Scapegoats and witches. In the face of such overwhelming and random death, the human need for a cause, for someone to blame, became desperate. This fear created fertile ground for scapegoating. During the first wave of the Black Death in the 1340s, blame often fell on Jewish communities who were falsely accused of an international conspiracy to poison Christian wells. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, the primary scapegoat had become the witch. If the plague was not an act of God, it must be an act of human evil, carried out by Satan's agents on earth. This connection was not just paranoia. Medical practitioners, unable to offer any real cure, sometimes found it convenient to attribute a death to witchcraft, absolving themselves of failure. The idea of the plague spreader, a sorcerer deliberately poisoning a community, took hold across Europe. In Geneva, in the 1540s, a plague outbreak led to a witch hunt where 34 people were executed for conspiring to spread the pestilence through sorcery. The legal methods used in these trials, often involving torture to extract confessions, provided a direct template for the great witch hunts that followed. In Britain, the link is clear in the timing of major hunts. The Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1649 to 1650 occurred in a society traumatized by decades of plague, civil war, and religious turmoil. The Radical Kirk Party sought to create a godly society by rooting out witches, leading to over 600 accusations and more than 300 executions in just 2 years. This hunt was aided by the sinister work of witch prickers. These men, most notoriously John Kincaid, claimed they could infallibly identify a witch by finding the devil's mark on their body, a spot that, when pricked with a needle, would not bleed or feel pain. For a fee, they would confirm a community's suspicions, and their testimony was often treated as proof positive of guilt. In England, the infamous witch-finder general, Matthew Hopkins, led a terrifying campaign during the Civil War years of the 1640s, a time of immense social breakdown. He and his associates were responsible for the deaths of an estimated 300 women. Even when plague wasn't the direct cause of an accusation, it had created the narrative. The infamous case of the Witches of Warboys in the 1590s, where a family was hanged based on the fits of several young girls, became a sensation. A pamphlet detailing the case served as a how-to manual for anyone wanting to fake an illness and blame it on a witch. It standardized the supposed symptoms of bewitchment, howling in pain, hallucinations, and the theatrical vomiting of objects like pins. The plague had established the terrifying idea of sudden, inexplicable illness as an attack by a hidden enemy. The witch became the local, personalized face of that terror. The devil's shadow. The belief that the plague was a supernatural evil, a direct assault by the devil, was widespread. Even royalty saw a demonic hand at work. In the previous century, King Edward VI wrote to his bishops that the plague was vexing his subjects because they had been corrupted by the devil to rebel against God. This meant the fight against it had to be spiritual as well as physical. Rituals of protection and purification were paramount. In London, great bonfires were lit in the streets, their smoke intended to cleanse the corrupt air. People carried sponges soaked in vinegar or smoked tobacco constantly, even children, believing the strong smells would create a protective barrier. In Scotland, residents burned fragrant herbs like juniper and rosemary to purify their homes, and some believed that leaving peeled onions on the floor for 10 days would absorb all the infection from a room. Some folk cures were even more extreme, blurring the line between medicine and magic. The Vicary method, named for an English doctor, involved strapping a live chicken's plucked backside to a plague sore, believing the bird would draw the poison out. Other desperate remedies included pastes made from tree resin and human excrement, applied directly to lanced buboes. The soundscape of a plague city was dominated by the tolling of bells. Bells were believed to have the power to drive away evil spirits, and so they rang constantly for the dying and the dead. In one London parish, St. Giles in the Fields, the death toll in July 1665 was so high that the bell rang almost without pause. The constant, mournful sound caused such profound distress to the living that an order was given to stop it entirely. At night, another sound would join the tolling. It was the handbell of the dead bellman, who walked ahead of the corpse cart, his voice crying out the infamous phrase, "Bring out your dead." The men who performed this task, the bearers and buriers, were essential, yet reviled. Driven by poverty and the lack of any other work, they undertook the most dangerous job in the city. They were accused of profiting from misery, searching the pockets of corpses and stripping them of their clothes before tipping them, naked, into the great plague pits. They operated in a world where the normal rules of life and death had been suspended. One grimly comic story, recounted by Defoe, tells of a drunken piper who fell asleep on a stall and was mistaken for a corpse. He was tossed into the dead cart and only awoke as he was about to be tipped into a mass grave, terrifying the bearers who thought a dead man had come back to life. In some places, the devil's role was not just a belief, but a story. In the Scottish village of Forvey, folklore tells of a demonic priest who held the villagers in his thrall. When his true identity was discovered, he stood upon a hill and cursed them, summoning a great storm that buried the entire village in sand, a natural disaster reimagined as a direct act of satanic vengeance. In Ireland, tales were common of the devil himself appearing at a game of cards, a charming stranger, until someone dropped a card and saw, beneath the table, his cloven hooves. The devil was not an abstract concept. He was a shadow that could walk right into your home. Folklore of specific places. The memory of the plague is etched into the geography of Britain, with certain places becoming permanent sites of supernatural dread. Nowhere is this more true than in Eyam, the famous plague village in Derbyshire. In 1665, when the plague arrived in a bundle of cloth from London, the villagers made the heroic decision to quarantine themselves to prevent the disease spreading. For 14 months, they endured. The dead were buried in their own gardens or in fields, like the lonely Riley graves, where a woman named Elizabeth Hancock buried her husband and 6 children in just 8 days. Today, Eyam is said to be one of Britain's most haunted villages. The ghost of Catherine Mompesson, the rector's wife who died in the final days of the outbreak, is said to wander the churchyard. The old plague cottages are haunted by a pleasant-faced lady who wears a blue smock, while at the Miners' Arms pub, guests have fled in the night from phantom footsteps and strange occurrences. Eyam Hall, built just after the plague, is reportedly haunted by a servant girl who drowned in the well, and by an older man whose presence is so persistent that an upstairs room has been permanently locked. In Edinburgh, the old city is riddled with plague ghosts. Mary King's Close, a 17th-century street devastated by the 1645 plague, was later partially sealed and built over. While the popular tale of it being deliberately bricked up to contain the sick is an urban myth, the Close has been considered one of Scotland's most haunted locations for centuries, home to the spirit of Annie, a lonely little girl believed to be a plague victim. A more horrific legend tells of a nursery on the Royal Mile, where plague-infected children were bricked up with their mothers to die. The site is now the Museum of Childhood, where staff report hearing the disembodied crying of children. Nearby, at Greyfriars Kirkyard, It's said a homeless man broke into a mausoleum and fell through the floor into a plague pit below. His terrified escape is believed to have awakened the violent Mackenzie poltergeist. London's plague pits have their own dark folklore. At Charterhouse Square, schoolboys once dared each other to press their ears to the ground at midnight, claiming they could hear the screams of victims buried alive. Aldgate Tube Station is believed to sit on a mass grave of over 1,000 bodies, haunted by the ghost of an old woman who appears on the tracks. In Kent, on the desolate Dead Man's Island, the exposed bones of prisoners who died of disease litter the shore. Local folklore warns of devilish dogs with glowing red eyes that roam the island, feasting on the dead. In Lincoln, the memory of the Black Death is preserved in a powerful ghost story. A mass grave was dug on unconsecrated ground near the cathedral's judgment porch. Legend holds that once a year, the ghosts of the plague victims rise from the pit, form a spectral procession, and march to the cathedral doors, singing for the proper Christian rites they were denied in their hurried burial. And in Wales, a folk practice from the Black Death eerily mirrors that of Eyam. In the quarantine town of Builth Wells, people paid for supplies by throwing money into a brook, which became known as Nant Yar Arian, meaning money brook, trusting the running water would wash the coins clean of pestilence. Reflections. The folklore of the plague years is a dark mirror, reflecting the deepest fears of a society living on the edge of annihilation. These stories and rituals were not born of ignorance, but of a profound human need to find meaning in chaos, to exert some control over the uncontrollable, and to remember the dead in a time when death had become commonplace. The plague watchers, the charms, the ghosts, and the scapegoats, they are all part of a complex tapestry of belief that helped our ancestors navigate a world of unimaginable terror. They show us that when faced with the abyss, humanity will always create stories to light the darkness. The science has changed, but the fear and the power of belief remain as potent as ever. Thank you for joining us at the Candlelight Historian. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories from the shadows of history. And now we turn to you. Does your local town or village have its own legends from the plague years? A haunted field, a strange local custom, or a ghost story passed down through generations? Share your stories in the comments below. We would love to hear them.